Bombay, India, January 1986. The World Congress for the Synthesis of Science and Religion. Certainly, man is reaching the pinnacle of his material development. Stunning progresses have been made in the last 100 years in the fields of science and technology. There have been great strides made in the advancement in the realm of medicine, communications, transport, electronics, and in many aspects of life. All these fields have certainly contributed in great ways to the progress of the physical well-being of mankind. Yet, even to the casual observer, it is apparent that not all is well with life, with the human beings on this planet today. As we look around, we see what a widespread, deep impact that scientific and technological society has made on all facets of our living. Pollution in the cities and villages, rapid depletion of natural resources, a rise in the crime rate, and an alarming drop in the quality of life all over the world and in all walks of life. Frequent wars between countries, mounting international tensions, and even the grim prospect of wholesale destruction through a nuclear holocaust. We see that as man has moved from the village into the city, the stressful life of the industrialized city has contributed to a substantial drop in the quality of life, private, family, communal, national, and even global. It is becoming apparent that our one-sided concentration on the development of our physical well-being has certainly resulted in the erosion of the more deep and abiding inner values. Most critical observers seem to agree that we must not only concentrate on the development of our external well-being, but also focus on probing the inner dimensions of the spiritual needs of all living entities. Thus, there does seem to be a case of genuine need to look beyond science for the total prosperity of mankind. In what direction should we look? Could it be a synthesis of science and religion? It is apparent that science by itself and religion by itself cannot alone solve all of man's problems. Could there be a harmonious synthesis of the two? Not so much in terms of bringing these two together and forging a new discipline, rather to assimilate the values of both science and religion and evaluate the conclusions for the benefit of all. It is with this in mind that the Bhaktivedanta Institute brought together eminent international scholars to a common platform to discuss all facets of these issues. That the time and place was more than appropriate for the theme of this sort was echoed by almost all the delegates who were present at the Congress. In a pre-Congress press meeting at the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, these topics were discussed.
A very auspicious time to attempt a synthesis of science and religion. We have had almost a century now of controversy between science and religion, perhaps particularly in the West.
I agree with my colleague, Professor Wall, that it is an auspicious time. I would perhaps even say an urgent time for those of us who work in the field of religion and those who work in the various fields of science to meet each other, to try to understand each other, and to try to overcome some of the obstacles and misperceptions which have divided us. I use the word urgent for this time because I think all of us at this table would agree that our human species stands at an urgent crossroads. Whether or not there will be a future for our species depends in some measure on whether the vast amounts of power which science has put in our hands will be directed toward purposes spiritually constructive and humanly worthwhile, or whether they will be directed toward inhuman and destructive ends.
My own view, and I speak as a member of what some people would say is probably a cathedral of science, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, the United States, is that at least we in the West, if not the whole world, have become intoxicated with the science. And that what we need now, perhaps, is a period of detoxification. And we need to look at other ways of knowing the world in order to help us through this process.
Bhaktivedanta Institute was formed by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, the founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The primary purpose of the Bhaktivedanta Institute is to expose to the scholarly communities of the world, scientists, philosophers, theologians, educationists, all the leaders of the world, to understand what is the ultimate purpose of life and the meaning of life. So in the World Congress for the Synthesis of Science and Religion has been organized by Bhaktivedanta Institute to provide a platform of having a very important dialogue among these leading scholars of the world to define the issues that we face in our day-to-day activities today around the world, and suggest some possible ways of easing these tensions in our human society. So we felt that a program of bringing the leaders from the fields of science and also from the fields of religion. So if we bring these two important categories of people together and discuss these important issues, that we will see a very significant result to bring this international harmony and understanding. So for that purpose, we've organized this World Congress for the Synthesis of Science and Religion as a part of the celebrations of Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's 500th anniversary festival.
The inaugural session saw three very distinguished persons setting the pace and tone for the discussions during the rest of the Congress. The inaugural speech was delivered by His Holiness Dalai Lama, who stressed from several angles the need for a synthesis.
The main motivation and main goal is, helping or serving humanity. So on that goal also, the point where could meet. If you ask, the material comfort is sufficient for everything? Certainly not. Because there is another factor or another thing which we call mind. Formless, colorless, but there is something which we can feel. Is something very strong. Compare now, for example, compare the physical pleasure as well as pain and mental pleasure and pain. Compare these two things. The mental is more important, more superior than the physical pains and pleasure.
Although science is able more and more to explain the laws of nature, in spite of its remarkable progress in over 300 years since the time of Newton, there have been a few fields that remain completely sealed to the empirical approach of modern science. Professor George Wald has identified two of the most important of these, namely, 1, the cosmology of the universe outside, and number 2, the nature of the world within, namely, the mind and consciousness.
We know now that we live in a historical universe, one in which not only living organisms, but stars and galaxies are born, mature, grow old, and die. There is good reason to believe it to be a universe permeated with life, in which life arises wherever the conditions exist that make it possible, given enough time. How many such places are there? Well, Arthur Eddington, the British physicist, gave us the formula. 10 to the 11th stars, 10 to the 11th. That's 100 billion. Those are American billions, each of them 1,000 million. So, 10 to the 11th stars make a galaxy. There is nothing whatever that I can do as a scientist to identify either the presence or absence of consciousness. Nothing. So I find myself full of certain prejudices. The simple reality is that consciousness is not approachable by science. And my own thought is that it's going to stay that way. That it's going to stay that way. That we can do make all kinds of observations, do all kinds of experiments, work out all the machinery. But the essence escapes us.
With the second keynote address, Dr. Karan Singh brought a refreshing focus on the human factor in analyzing the issues and dangers that face mankind.
Science and religion began together in the mists of antiquity. Then they diverged. And when the materialistic paradigm, shall we say the Cartesian, Newtonian, Marxist paradigm, was at its height, it appeared that science and religion were poles apart. But the significance of the 20th century, as Dr. Wald has pointed out, lies in the fact that in our own lifetimes, that materialistic paradigm has collapsed. The greatest scientists of this century and the great scientists who have assembled here are not people who are opposed to religion, but are men and women who realize that the quest for reality, whether outside or within ourselves, is essentially the most important quest upon which man is embarked.
In the second session, Interaction Between Science and Religion, Historical Perspectives, the scene was set by examining in a historical perspective the way science and religion has each developed an influence on society, and the way they have interacted on each other, and what this interaction meant to mankind in general. Professor Harvey Cox, in his opening lecture, presented a remarkably lucid analysis of the story of the interaction between science and religion in the West, which he called a lover's quarrel.
For over 2 millennia now, science and religion have engaged in an ongoing lover's quarrel. Tiffs and bickering, altercations, some very serious, some not so serious, some merely imaginary, some dragged out, some quickly forgotten. But during the arguments, they were always somehow aware that they really needed each other. And I believe that indeed this recognition was still there during even most of the tempestuous moments when the irritated lovers said to each other, "I never want to see you again."
Others who explored the different facets of this historical interaction between science and religion were Professor Ernan McMullen, who spoke on the impact of the theory of evolution on religious thought in the West.
The impact of Darwinism is felt even today. In the last 20 years in the United States, for complicated social reasons in part, there has been a very strong attempt on the part of certain fundamentalist groups to propose an alternative account, which they call creation science, which would seem to them to be a preferable alternative to creation, to the accounts based on evolution.
In responding to Professor McMullen was Dr. T.D. Singh, the International Director for the Bhaktivedanta Institute. He brought out the implications to the theory of evolution as it has been in the East, citing certain perspectives from the Vedic text.
He said, no, it is not due to mutation, according to this model. Rather, according to the free will and the karma, the word karma comes into function here in this concept, that karma and the free will, because of those laws of karma, so these living entities, these different forms of living entities are there, and the living entities entering into that different forms according to the law of karma.
To show that scientific inspiration doesn't always come by itself, and that many great scientists of various times did have religious inspiration as a source of much of their contemplation, was the main theme of Professor William Shea's talk.
Now, it so happens that Newton spent most of his time reading books that we would call hermetic, I sometimes prefer the word mystical, in the hope that he would find in this literature the inspiration for a new interpretation of nature.
Dr. B.P. Subbarayappa responded to Professor Shea's talk by presenting how religion formed the basis for scientific development even in ancient India.
With the universal self. Now, the concept of matter and form found an ingenious solution in terms of various geometrical propositions. In fact, the Vedic geometry is supposed to be the earliest, and even there you have the elements, the proto-elements of the so-called Pythagorean theorem.
The third session, on the second day morning, was entitled Science and Religion, Search for the Perennial. It addressed more fundamental issues concerning about the nature and the process of obtaining knowledge, or what are known as epistemological considerations in both science and in religion. In a keynote speech, world-famous professor of religion and author of the book Religions of the World, a classic in its field, Professor Houston Smith analyzed the role between science and religion as being one between the part and the whole. He characterized science as a part and religion as a whole.
The point is that I think the wisdom traditions have always pointed out that if we're incapable of surrendering, which is to say giving our lives to anything, to other persons in love or friendship, to a cause, to the call of duty, if we're incapable of giving ourselves, this is a flaw in our humanity, which is at least as great as deficiencies in our power of control.
There were a variety of speakers who touched upon the nature of scientific knowledge and religious knowledge in different ways. Following were Dr. Eileen Barker, Dean of Undergraduate Studies and eminent social scientist from the London School of Economics.
I find it useful to start from a conception of science as a discipline, a body of knowledge that A, has as its object of study the natural world, and that B, uses an empirical method of investigating the facts of nature, which for our purpose can include the social world as it is constructed by men and women.
Also was one of the leading statisticians in America today, Professor Jaya Srivastava from the Department of Statistics, Colorado State University.
Ladies and gentlemen, the spiritual part of all religions is the same. It deals with the quest for God. Its common message is love of God. Therefore, any individual or organization which promotes the love of God movement must be appreciated.
The Honorable Mr. Francis Dore spoke on his favorite field of specialization, namely the scientific content in Hindu thought.
And Hinduism, as you may know, is a word that has been coined by the West.